All right, there's two guys in America you can count on talking college football in February, March, April, May, June, all through the offseason. One's right here, Mark Rogers TV. The other one, of course, go for the two.com, Joe Lisi. Hey, Joe, it's been a while. Good to see you.
Thanks, Mark. It's always football season 24/7 with me, so I can't wait to talk about some college football.
Yeah, so let's zero in on the SEC because we know you've written a series of articles looking at some of the best non-conference matchups, and those are the games that I really salivate for thinking about the opener coming up at the end of August. Those non-conference matchups, those games that we really can look forward to and trying to compare these teams, these conferences, and finally Texas A&M's playing one of these kind of games because it's been a while since the Aggies have really played somebody decent out of conference. Johnny Manziel didn't play anybody. They didn't play anyone last year for Cupcakes, the likes of Lamar and Rice. But this year, we've got Arizona State coming to Kyle Field. You've looked at this game in terms of some of the numbers that set up from last year to this year. So kind of break this thing down for us.
Well, I think it's interesting when you look at Texas A&M overall. You talk about their three losses in the middle of the year to Mississippi State, Ole Miss, and Alabama. They were outscored by a margin of 142-51. They committed 7 turnovers in those matchups. So turnovers and ball security not on the way of Texas A&M. They were -7 overall in turnover margin. Played better on the road than they did at home. They had a 5-2 overall mark on the road or on a neutral field site, 3-3 at home. And what's interesting, Mark, is in the last 4 games in November, the offense is what failed them. They were 138 total yards less than their season average only 316 total yards from an offensive perspective prior to that bowl game against West Virginia. And that's why they only won 2 games in the month of November. So you saw the offensive production from the A&M Aggies wear out during the end of the season. And I think offensively, that's what was staggering when I looked at the numbers from A&M and turnover margin. You cannot win games if you're turning the ball over and not playing clean with the football. So that's going to be an interesting matchup when they face Arizona State. When Arizona State beat 4 of 6 top 25 competition. This is the team that had a 5-game stretch, 5-game winning streak that they knocked off opponents with a winning percentage of over 600. So this is a solid team in Arizona State. Mike Bercovici comes back, took over for Taylor Kelly when he was out in the middle of the year. So this is a solid team that they're going to be facing week 1 of the season in the Arizona State Sun Devils.
Typically, when the SEC goes outside of conference, it has a huge speed advantage. I would think that this would be one of the exceptions. Arizona State can run with just about everyone typically on defense. And you mentioned the quarterback situation still in good shape despite the departure of Taylor Kelly with a lot of experience coming back. South Carolina, North Carolina, Joe, we saw the matchup to start off 2 seasons ago, actually, South Carolina, North Carolina, when Jadeveon Clowney was the guy with the target on his back from the media. South Carolina, of course, concluded that season with 11 wins, a much different South Carolina team last year. They've got this return date from North Carolina. The Tar Heels were the division favorite that didn't come through, gave up all sorts of points on defense. So set us up with the Tar Heels and the Gamecocks.
Well, when you look at South Carolina overall, we knew they had a defensive inexperience to start the year. It was shown week number 1 against Kenny Hill and Texas A&M. They ripped that South Carolina Gamecock secondary. But what was interesting in the 6 losses for South Carolina this season, they failed to rush for over 120 yards in 4 of those games. That's a glaring statistic. When you look at the overall rushing offense of South Carolina from 2013 to 2014, another glaring statistic. They rushed as a team for a total of 198 rushing yards per game with Mike Davis. Now the drop-off in 2014 only averaged 161 yards per game. So from an offensive perspective, South Carolina not getting it done, rushing the football, put a lot of pressure on Dylan Thompson, put a lot of pressure on that offensive line, made them one-dimensional, and that's why you saw South Carolina drop 6 of those ball games last year offensively. They're going to be going up against a team that has major defensive woes in North Carolina. You're talking about a team in North Carolina last year, Mark. Their losses were glaring. They gave up over 46 points per game and over 500 yards of total offense. Third down conversions for the Tar Heels. Overall, they gave up 49% third down conversions throughout the season. That's almost 50%. That's one of the worst statistical defenses in the country. It ranked 117th overall out of 128 teams. So in order for South Carolina to get this victory week number 1, they're going to have to make up for the offensive production from Dylan Thompson, and they're going to have to make up for the offensive production in rushing the football, something they did not do in their losses last year.
You have to wonder if a window has not closed on South Carolina after 3 consecutive 11-win campaigns, finishing in the top 10 all 3 seasons. A step back and going 7-6, really missing Connor Shaw on offense, and more specifically because Dylan Thompson was a capable quarterback. More so the big playmakers, the NFL-type players on defense, Sutton, Quarles, Clowney, those guys, they have not recruited with their competitors in the SEC Eastern Division in the last few years. And South Carolina looks to be a fairly average team this year. I do really like Sky Moore coming back at linebacker, one of the best in the SEC. He's all over the place, and because of some of the development of their other linebackers, he's going to be able to roam as a rover back at linebacker, and they're going to let him freelance and make some plays. You mentioned North Carolina, even making a Rutgers pedestrian offense look terrific in the bowl game. The Scarlet Knights tore up the Tar Heels to finish off the 6-7 season. Marquise Williams, of course, back at quarterback, one of the better throwers in the ACC. We've got a matchup with Wisconsin taking on Alabama that I really look forward to. Last year it was Wisconsin, LSU in Houston. This time the Badgers, they're not backing down from anyone recently with the LSU game, a game that they had in hand at 24-7. Melvin Gordon got hurt, knocked out of the game. He was running right through the LSU defense. They lost 2 defensive tackles in the fourth quarter. They give up the 17-point lead, lose that one late, but Wisconsin making amends against the SEC on New Year's Day with a dramatic win against Auburn, in which Melvin Gordon again went off. Alabama, of course, they've got all the talent in the world, but something missing last year. Maybe it was a defensive secondary help. Blake Sims making a couple key mistakes against Ohio State. They lose the semifinal game. So we've got one that I'm going to circle my calendar on, Wisconsin, Alabama.
I think when you look at Wisconsin overall, the glaring thing that stood out for me in their losses last year to LSU, to Ohio State, and to Northwestern was that they all came on the road or on a neutral field site. So that's one glaring statistic when you look at this week 1 matchup. They're playing on a neutral field site against the Alabama Crimson Tide. The other thing that really stands out for me is Wisconsin did not play well on the road in terms of ball security. -7 in turnover margin on the road or on a neutral field site. Again, you cannot win games when you're turning the ball over and failing to run the football. So that's a glaring statistic when I look at Wisconsin overall. They struggled on the road away from Madison, turned the ball over in those ball games. That's why they lost to Northwestern. That's why they lost to LSU and Ohio State. And secondly, pass production. Couldn't stretch the field vertically with Joel Stabby. New head coach now in Paul Chryst, who was there with Russell Wilson. He brings a dynamic in terms of offensive play calling ability, but he's got to develop that talent again that was left by Gary Anderson. Can he do it? I think so, but it might take a while for the team to get acclimated to his system. When you look at Alabama overall, it's what I brought up all last year, Mark. This team was not the same defense that it was in years past. -2 in turnover margin. They weren't minus in turnover margin since prior to 2008 under Nick Saban, his first year getting there. So that's a glaring statistic. The other one is they were a top 10 defense in terms of rushing defense, only giving up 104 rushing yards per game. But when you dig a little bit deeper into the teams that they played, when they played a team like Ohio State, they gave up 289 rushing yards. When they played the better teams with the SEC, like Tennessee, they gave up 181 yards, 136 to Mississippi State and 176 to Auburn. So they gave up a lot of rushing yards that weren't shown in the overall statistics to better teams on their schedule. They're going to be facing a run-heavy offense in Wisconsin. That's a cause of concern week number one. And if you're an Alabama fan, if you're asking me, and then their lack of creating turnovers and ball security is the one glaring statistic that I see out of Alabama last season in the 2014 campaign.
Joe Lisi joins us from GoForThe2.com. During the season, we wrap it up every Tuesday night looking at the best games in the top 25 and breaking those down and giving predictions. Joe joins us in the offseason because he's written a series of articles looking at the best non-conference matchups early season in college football. We're focusing this video segment on the SEC. And the last one to throw you, Joe, Auburn, Louisville. I love what Louisville's doing here in terms of a scheduling approach. They've got the game with Kentucky every year. Kentucky, of course, downtrodden in the SEC, typically much better. Recently, they've gained some top 20 recruiting classes, but they go out Louisville and schedule another SEC opponent, a very quality one in Auburn. So we've got the Tigers minus Nick Marshall with Duke Williams at wide receiver, and of course Jeremy Johnson taking over at quarterback, taking on Louisville.
Well, I think when you look at Louisville overall, keep in mind they only played one top 25 team, Florida State, last year. So that's a glaring statistic. When I look at the Cardinals' overall record, you look at their wins, they came by a combined margin of winning percentage of 42% on their 9 victories. When you look at their 4 losses on the year, Mark, they came by 73 winning percentage of their opponents. And then when you look at their points in terms of production, offensive production, they averaged 31 points per game. But in their losses, Mark, the offense failed them. They only averaged 20.7 points per game from an offensive perspective. Not going to win a lot of ball games when you're really scoring 11 points less than your season average. So they beat up on the bad teams on their schedule. When they had to step up in competition, they couldn't knock off those teams. So that's a glaring statistic. When I look at Bobby Petrino's crew entering the 2015 season, when you look at Auburn, a lot of glaring statistics offensively and defensively. The first one is they're going to lose their big 3. Nick Marshall, their quarterback, Cameron Artis-Payne, and Sammy Coates. When you look at Artis-Payne and Nick Marshall overall, they accounted for 24 of the 32 rushing touchdowns by Auburn last year. That's 75% of the rushing touchdowns by the Tigers were accounted by Nick Marshall and Cameron Artis-Payne. So that's a big drop-off in production. You look at Sammy Coates. He led the team with 741 receiving yards. He also had 4 touchdowns. He's gone. That puts all the pressure on Duke Williams' shoulders. Now, I know it's Gus Malzahn's system, but that's asking a lot for a lot of new players and skilled players, quarterback, running back, and wide receivers to step up and make up that offensive production, especially week number 1 of this season. I don't see it happening. To me, I think it takes time for players to get acclimated. Defensively, a lot of glaring statistics out of Auburn overall. They've dropped 4 of their 6 games to top 25 competition. As a defensive unit, we've heard a lot of experts say it was the secondary that failed them. Well, they gave up as a defensive unit last year 163 total rushing yards per game. On the road or on a neutral field site, they gave up 220 rushing yards per game. But in their 5 losses last year, Mark, they gave up 263 rushing yards per game. They gave up 289 to Georgia. They gave up 227 to Alabama. They gave up 176 to Texas A&M. They gave up 236 to Mississippi State. And they gave up 400 to Wisconsin. Glaring statistics when you look at the rushing defense by the Auburn Tigers. It's not just their secondary. It's the defensive line that they're going to have to fix. Not an easy fix, in my opinion. It's going to be a very tough game for Auburn week number 1 of the season.
Yeah, Auburn definitely missed D Ford going to the NFL from the championship team in the SEC that played Florida State. And also, they expected to have Carl Lawson, who was lost to injury in August. He had an exceptional stretch drive to his freshman year. A much different quarterback going from Nick Marshall to Jeremy Johnson. Nick Marshall, with the quick feet, ran that triple option to perfection. Jeremy Johnson is 6'5". He's a passer, he's a pocket guy. He's a long strider, so he can run, but he's not going to make people miss in the open field. Not going to run the triple attack option like Nick Marshall. So their play calling is going to be much different this season at Auburn. And again, like you say, we pick on the secondary, but the defensive line has got to get better this season. They've recruited those pieces, but are they too young? We shall see. And Louisville coming off that 9-4 campaign, but as you note, when they played the big boys like Georgia and Florida State, it was not pretty. Joe Lisi from GoForThe2.com joining us to break down some college football out-of-conference matchups. And I am ready for college football, Joe. When I look at these kind of games being set up in September, wow, I got to dive in right now.
Me too, Mark. I mean, it's interesting. The reason why I wrote the articles, we're in spring practice now. I know personnel issues everybody's concentrating on. I wanted to take a deeper look into the performances of the 2014 season, see where these teams' weaknesses were offensively and defensively, and I could see where they match up week number 1 of the season. It's going to be a long road until we get to August, but I really want to see which teams statistically are weak offensively and defensively, and I think we touched on it in this video.
All right, Joe, we appreciate the time as always.
Always a pleasure.